In this episode of Open College with Dr. Stephen Hicks, Professor Hicks sits down with Professor Jordan Peterson, Professor of Psychology at the University of Toronto. This is a 40-minute excerpt of the full-length interview hosted by Dr. Peterson. If you'd like to listen to the full interview, please go to the Jordan B. Peterson podcast feed or visit jordanbpeterson.com.
I thought we might start by talking about Explaining Postmodernism again, your 2011 book, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, because I know that it's been perhaps more controversial of late than it was when you originally published it. And I'm curious about the sales and the academic and the public reaction.
Right. Well, sales have been strong. The book was originally published in 2004 and sold steadily for the first decade or so, which is quite gratifying for an academic book. And then starting about 3 years ago, in part because postmodernism started to spill out of the strictly academic intellectual world into the broader cultural world, sales picked up again. And so there's been kind of a two-front set of discussions, one at the intellectual level and one at the more public level as well. Gratifyingly, lots of translations. I think there will be 3 more translations added this year. Arabic, Hebrew, and Estonian are in the works. So altogether, I'm pleased with that. The reactions are quite polarized, in part because reactions to postmodernism itself are polarized. It's an extreme movement, as good, deep thinking should be. Even if I disagree fundamentally with postmodernism, it is a well-articulated negative outlook on most of life's philosophical questions. And so we should expect that any movement that pushes buttons fundamentally like that should get some extreme reactions. And the same thing holds for me when I push back against, in my book, some of these strong, to my mind, ultimately nihilistic claims that postmodernism ends up making. I also get the negative pushback. The pushback kind of comes in 2 forms. I've found from the professional reviews. There have been 8, to my knowledge, by professional philosophers in the philosophy journals, and they are generally strong to very strongly positive. The normal scholarly quibbles arise. When I get reviews from academics outside of the philosophy, they tend to be more polarized, some strongly in favor, but then particularly people in history, in sociology, in rhetoric studies and literature, places where there are stronger contingents of postmodern thinkers, I tend to get strongly negative responses. And those responses are also mirrored in the kind of the general thinking public when they respond and write back and write reviews.
Well, maybe it would be useful to bring people up to date for you to give us a brief overview of your view of postmodernism, like a definition. It's one of those tricky terms like existentialism or phenomenology that are bandied about by people, educated people, on a fairly regular basis, but where the definition itself is slippery and difficult to pin down. So maybe you could talk a little bit about how you view postmodernism and also what argument you made with regards to the history of its development.
Right. Well, it makes sense that it's slippery, in part because postmodernism philosophically avoids categorizations, avoids broad sweeping statements, although they do make some. So anytime you try to make a precise, broad sweeping claim about what this postmodernism amounts to, you will get pushback on that. But there is a broadly unifying set of themes to postmodernism. If you start by breaking the term down, it's postmodernism. So first you have to say, what is modernism, such that postmodernism is reacting against it or saying that we need to go beyond. And modernism is used variously in different fields. There's modernism in art, in literature. I'm using a philosophical and historical understanding of postmodernism, and that's how it's mostly used now. That is to say, we look at the modern world. So that essentially is the last 400 to 500 years of history, at least in the Western tradition. So what's going on in the world 500 years ago is a revolutionary transformation of Western society. We have Columbus crossing the ocean, and so we're entering into a new era of globalization. The Renaissance is in full swing, and its impact, late 1400s, early 1500s, is now being felt all over Europe. There is the Protestant Reformation and the Counter-Reformation. So religious life in the West is being dramatically transformed. You see the beginnings of science with thinkers like Copernicus and Vesalius in anatomy. And so scientific method is being developed, and all of the things that we now recognize as the scientific disciplines are being founded. So that's the modern world starting 400 or 500 years ago. Philosophically, we start looking at the analyses that are being offered by thinkers like Francis Bacon, René Descartes, and others. And we see that they are putting thought on a different foundation from that had gone on earlier.
In Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, he writes an incredibly crafted and well-argued insight into what postmodernism is, why it exists, and why it is dangerous applied in the wrong dose, in the wrong place, as it frequently is in this day and age. Postmodernism has been the most vigorous intellectual movement of the late 20th century. In his book, Hicks traces the roots of postmodernism all the way back to the Enlightenment era, where he systematically charts how the age of reason sowed the seeds of unreason that was to follow, making a clear connection between postmodernism to history, leftist politics, and even the ugliness of contemporary art. Hicks presents his thesis with beautiful, easy-to-understand explanations that burn with logic and common sense. So if you've ever wondered why society holds so many assumptions about the world, and you want to understand the chaos of what is happening, Hicks's work in this book provides a huge piece to this puzzle. Why do skeptical and relativistic arguments have such power in the contemporary intellectual world? Why do they have that power in the humanities but not in the sciences? Why is a significant portion of the political left the same left that traditionally promoted reason, science, equality for all, and optimism now switch to the themes of anti-reason, anti-science, double standards and cynicism? This book is by far the most helpful resource I've ever come across for understanding why the world is turning into a direction that I just can't comprehend. Pick up your copy of Stephen Hicks's book, Explaining Postmodernism, Skepticism and Socialism from Rousseau to Foucault, available now on Amazon.com. While you're online, make sure to subscribe to the Open College podcast, hosted by Stephen Hicks himself, and please leave a review for it on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
The thing about science that makes it so peculiar, I think, is that science is actually a technology that enables people who are bright, but not that bright, let's say, to genuinely produce advances in knowledge because of the method, right? I mean, if you're a careful scientist, look, when we studied what predicted academic achievement, for example, both in graduate school and among faculty members, creativity didn't even enter the equation. Intelligence did, and so did conscientiousness. But I think it's partly because with the scientific method, you can actually break down your knowledge seeking into a set of implementable technological steps, and that enables it to be implemented on an incredibly broad scale. And even if a lot of it is error-ridden, which is obviously the case, and to a scandalous degree to somewhat lately, it still means that as hundreds of thousands of us, and increasingly now millions of us, grind away slowly at this careful technology of knowledge acquisition, that overall we do seem to be able to predict and to control the world better. And then that started to become questioned. You know, one of the things that seemed to characterize postmodernism, one definition that I've read, is skepticism of meta-narratives.
Right. Sorry, that's from Jean-Francois Lyotard. Right, and he is the one credited with labeling postmodernism philosophically, right? So, and defining it as a skepticism toward meta-narratives. Now, what that means, there's a couple of things built into that. One is, of course, the skepticism, And philosophy, for the last century and a half or so, has entered an increasingly skeptical mode. So that pushes back against the very broad claims that the early modernists are making, that the power of reason is great, it is highly competent, and that essentially we can figure out all of the important truths of the world. We can come up with a big story that explains everything, ultimately. Not necessarily that any one individual will contain all of that knowledge in his or her mind, but certainly communally, we'll have a huge amount of knowledge. We will slowly, as you're putting it together, piece together a big picture story about the way the world works. And then in principle, there's nothing about the universe that we can't figure out. They're just things that we haven't been able to figure out yet. So the skepticism that Lyotard and the others are talking about is a skepticism about that grand set of claims, right? A meta-narrative, a narrative that encompasses everything. Instead, we're left with smaller narratives, and then as the movement develops, we should be skeptical even about the truth status or the knowledge status of those smaller narratives. So what becomes important in the postmodern tradition is a skepticism about our ability to know the world in milder form as much as the modern thinkers thought we could, and in stronger postmodern form at all. That maybe there is no such thing as truth, no such thing as knowledge. Instead, all we have is opinions and beliefs that are subjectively held, but don't have any objective.
Well, it's like the postmodernists that were influenced by Saussure, for example. They seem to be convinced in some strange way of something that disturbed me when I first really discovered dictionaries when I was a kid. You know, I'd look up a word in a dictionary, and of course it would just refer to another word in the dictionary, and that would refer to another word in the dictionary. And there didn't seem to be, in some sense, any definition outside of the dictionary. And the French intellectuals that were so influential in the postmodern world seem to think of meaning in exactly that way. They understand that linguistic meaning is necessarily embedded in a larger linguistic context, so that each word is dependent on each phrase, and each phrase is dependent on each sentence. And so there's a contextual dependency of meaning on linguistic framing. But they seem to me to, and this is one of the major problems, I think, of postmodernism in university, is that they seem to deny or ignore the existence of any world whatsoever outside of linguistic construction. And that's something that strikes me as extraordinarily curious, that like it's a real denial of nature in my estimation, but also something tremendously dangerous, because, well, assuming that you think that physics and biology and chemistry actually have any sort of genuine reality, it denies the existence of a substrate of existence that the purely linguistic relates to. I mean, I always think of words as being like, and that's a Wittgensteinian idea, is that words are really tools that you use to operate on the world with, and the consequences of those operations are actually manifest in the world of sensation and perception and emotion and motivation and embodiment, rather than purely on a linguistic level. And so I also don't really understand how it could be that our intellectuals could come to the conclusion that and this seems like a primarily French idea, that our ideas are primarily constructed linguistically. I mean, how do animals exist under those circumstances?
Yeah. Now, that strong form of linguistic skepticism that you're articulating is most pronounced in Jacques Derrida, and he does bill himself as a post-structuralist. And that's a linguistic version of postmodernism. But the challenge here is that our view is that consciousness is a relational phenomenon, right? It's responsive to an external world. And that should be the fundamental realist commitment that we make. The problem that the post-structuralists are coming up with by the time we get to Derrida, I should say the idea that there isn't any sort of ontological substrate matching onto, not all of the postmodernists will buy into that as strongly as Derrida does. They might say, well, there's something out there, but we just can't know what the relationship is between our concepts and our words and an external reality. The point, though, is that the words that we use are abstractions, and they do come along fairly far or high up in our cognitive development. And if you want to argue that consciousness is a response to reality, or that consciousness is a relational phenomenon, as I do, to maintain that objective relational commitment there, what you then have to do is take up all of the skeptical arguments that want to put consciousness out of relationship, or to say that there's no way to bridge this gap between the subject and the object. Once you start going down that road, if you want to say, for example, that perception is fraught with illusions or hallucinations, or that we can't tell the difference between a veridical perception when our sensory organs are in contact with reality and a hallucination, well, then you have a gap between our conscious apparatus and reality. If you then want to go on and argue, as empiricists do, that our concepts and the words that we assign to the concepts are based on empirical observations or perceptual observations, but you now believe that those perceptual observations are subjective and out of relation with objective reality, then you're going to say these abstract concepts and words are also out of relation with reality. And then what gives them their meaning if you can't establish a connection between the words and reality? Then you're into the dictionary. You're saying, well, what gives the words their meaning? Is there sideways or network connections to other words? And then a generation or two later, you're into Derrida's university.
This July, Professor Stephen Hicks is coming to New York. Join him in a live debate discussing whether postmodernism is necessary for apolitics of individual liberty. For the negative, Professor of Philosophy at Rockford University, Executive Director of the Center of Ethics and Entrepreneurship, and Senior Scholar at the Atlas Society, Stephen Hicks is author of numerous books and published articles on the subject. His opponent for the affirmative will be Thaddeus Russell, a PhD history graduate from Columbia University who heads Renegade University and whose work has been published in multiple mainstream media channels. If you're in New York at the time, seeing these two scholars in a live debate is something you won't want to miss. The event will be held on July 15th at the Subculture Theatre on Bleecker Street, starting at 6:30 p.m, and seating must be reserved in advance. To reserve your spot, go to www.thesohoforum.org, scroll down to the event on Monday, July 15th, and simply click on the Buy Tickets link. And while you're online, please give the podcast a review on iTunes, Stitcher, Spotify, or Google Play, and follow us on our social networks at Open College Podcast. Now, back to the podcast.
You said the philosophers that have reviewed your book have been basically positive. What is it about philosophy and about philosophers or about your work that's eliciting a positive response from them?
Yeah. Well, my book is primarily an intellectual history. To some extent, I am polemical and pushing back against postmodernism, so people understand that I'm taking a stance as well. But the primary purpose of the book is to do a solid intellectual history. Where does this confusing, sprawling, but nonetheless very vigorous and powerful movement come from? It doesn't come out of thin air, but rather there's a lot of deep thinking that's behind it. So what I'm doing is I'm tracing what I see as the important intellectual movements of the last 2 centuries. So I'm starting with Kant and Rousseau, but I'm talking about Hegel, Marx, Nietzsche, Heidegger, and the others. So all of those figures are difficult, complex, and important in their own right. And there's scholarly debate about, say, how skeptical or not Kant is, whether there's an element of liberalism or not in Nietzsche, Heidegger's connection to the Nazis, and so forth. So there is a range of scholarly movement, and most of these major intellectuals have 2 or 3 major schools of interpretation attached to them. And so the pushback that I am getting on Kant or on Nietzsche or Heidegger or whatever will be from those who are in a different school of interpretation with respect to them. But typically among the philosopher, it's a respectful engagement because they will recognize that there is a very good argument that can be made for interpreting the philosopher the other way. And typically then what I'm doing is emphasizing the skeptical elements or the ultimately negative and nihilistic elements that get sifted out and woven together into ultimately the postmodern framework. And along the way, the philosophers who want to argue, well, this particular thinker is not that bad, or you would not buy into the whole project, those are the ones who will criticize me on various things. What I typically find, though, outside of philosophical circles, though, is, and this is not a criticism of these individuals, since we can't know everything, is that they will know something about Nietzsche or Heidegger or Kant, but they're not up on the scholarly literature. They've read one book or one article about that person that was written from a certain perspective. So if I make the argument for the other perspective on that thinker, it's new to them and it seems outrageous to them, and so they will react negatively to it.
We look for some unassailable truths. And for me, there are two unassailable pessimistic truths. And one is that a substantial proportion of life is going to be suffering because we're finite. And even if things are going well for you now, you're subject to illness, mental and physical. You're subject to the decimation of your dreams. You're going to lose the people that you love. The world that you know is going to change in ways that you find disconcerting and unfortunate. And so suffering's built in. And then
if you don't mind me interrupting at that point, the phrase unassailable truth, I think what we should be doing, though, in education is saying that there are no unassailable truths, that part of a good education is any previous generation's truths should be assailed, at least intellectually, by the students. They should challenge, question, and look at those truths, what the best arguments can be mounted against them, and then make their own judgments about whether they agree that this truth is in fact a truth or whether it needs to be rejected and moved on. So the great danger, I think, of postmodernism, though, is its skeptical stance toward the idea of there being truth at all. And then in its activist manifestation, when the professors are functioning as, I just have my subjective preferences and I have power in the classroom, and my view as a professor, or my practice rather as a professor, is simply to indoctrinate students in my subjective preferences. In that case, what you are doing is not only giving students a very cynical, negative, ultimately as an empty view of the world, but you are not at all training them in the ability to think for themselves, to compare competing viewpoints and make their own judgment. So that's the danger.
Right. Well, I guess I should reconsider my use of the word unassailable. I was thinking more, I suppose, clinically in some sense, in that my experience has been that you don't have to scratch very deeply beneath the surface of people's lives until you find massive sorrows that they're dealing with. And
I know you're not saying this, but from the student's perspective, it can't be that Professor Peterson, with all of his years of experience and wisdom, has announced that this is a truth, therefore it's a truth. They have to go through the process that you went through. Hopefully you can accelerate that process for them, but they have to go through that process.
Yeah, well, and I mean, I do that in the lectures by telling stories too, and illustrating the fact that the limitations that are placed on us that produce suffering. And I invite people, I would say, to draw their own conclusions about how they regard that reality in their own lives. And the second proposition, let's say, is that the suffering is often made worse by malevolence. And that can be, well, the sort of, what would you say, impersonal malevolence of nature, or the more personal malevolence of society or the individual. And so we're faced with that set of problems, that vulnerability that's characteristic of existence. And then that vulnerability, because it constitutes a real set of problems, calls to us to generate solutions. And it's in that attempt to generate solutions that adventure that you described earlier seems to me to manifest itself. And so it seems reasonable to me to suggest to young people that they do have a destiny that gives their life significant individual import, and that is to take arms up against the inequities of existence at whatever levels they can, and to act forthrightly and courageously to minimize unnecessary suffering and to constrain malevolence. And that it is also actually of vital importance that they do that, because their failure to do so is more damaging than they think. Their nihilism and cynicism that might entice them into nihilistic and destructive acts themselves actively is more destructive than they think. and their capacity to do positive things in the world on a large scale, individually and in their family and in their community, is much larger than they think. And it's very difficult for me to see how young people can be left uninformed of that as at least a potential reality without falling down the rabbit hole of nihilism and cynicism and subjectivism and relativism that seems to me to be at least one of the primary dangers of postmodernism.
Yes. Yeah, I think 100% on the latter part of what you were saying. I think on the should be an open question initially. Yes, there is suffering in the world. Yes, there is malevolence in the world. But we should also be open to the fact that there is pleasure, there is beauty, there is romance, there is adventure, there is genuine love in the world. And what proportions of benevolence versus malevolence, happiness versus suffering is possible and natural to human beings, that should be part of the conversation early on.
That's a conversation about the potency of your tools. Like, you could admit that these fundamental limitations exist, but you don't have to draw the conclusion that they're constraining in any finally hopeless manner.
Well, it's not just about the tools. It's also about the nature of the reality that we are confronting. There are, of course, people who are Pollyannists who have this view that the world is on our side. There's a benevolent God, or the forces of the universe are lined up such that I lead a charmed life and everything will go well for me. There are people at the other end of the spectrum, who argue the opposite. The fates are against me. The gods hate me no matter what I do. The forces that govern the universe will just grind me down. That's got nothing to do with my tool set initially, so to speak. That's a metaphysical claim about the nature of the universe. Now, when we do turn to the tool set, if whatever your position is along the spectrum of benevolence to malevolence, there is the question about how much power I have to craft my own tools, to forge myself into the kind of being that can take on life's challenges. And here I think postmodernism is dangerous in two important respects. In my view, the most important development of education, schooling, parenting, and so on, is giving students and young people the critical thinking, the rational power to be able to understand the world, to be able to conceptualize it, to know how to do the experiments, to analyze the results, to sort out good truth claims from bullshit, and so on. And so all of that cognitive development that can only come from a commitment to the idea that the evidence matters, that doing the experiments matters, that being excruciatingly honest with respect to the power of the arguments for and against positions that one might want to argue or adopt, that's absolutely important. The development of a student's rational, logical, critical capacity is fundamentally important, and postmodernism is an assault on that. And what that means is that in practice, students do not develop that most important life skill, and so put them out into the world without the tools that they need. And I think they are then more likely to feel disempowered. They're more likely to feel overwhelmed. And then we get the angry, despairing activist type of person that we see in larger numbers.
In his book, Entrepreneurial Living, 15 stories of innovation, risk, and achievement, and one story of abject failure, Professor Stephen Hicks has put together a series of interviews with entrepreneurs from 6 different countries and 7 US states to explore the adventure and the hard-headedness of business. In this book, Hicks explores what makes for entrepreneurial success and failure. To what extent does success depend on the key decisions, ideas, persistent action, or character traits? How does one's business life fit into one's overall life? And how does one even define success? Our belief is that we can always learn from the accomplishments and setbacks of others. The life stories from others can be informative, cautionary, and inspirational as we each strive to more fully realize our own potentials and achieve our own goals. The 16 entrepreneurs featured in this book are widespread geographically as well as in the range of their endeavors, from sports to education, to fashion to technology, to finance to advertising, to architecture, to cosmetics, and more. Observation of success and failure is often the best way to avoid pitfalls, learning from the mistakes of others to get on the pathway to success. This book doesn't disappoint, providing engaging and useful insights from the accounts of 16 entrepreneurs whose reflections are both personal to them and timeless in their significance for the rest of us. Pick up your copy of Entrepreneurial Living, 15 Stories of Innovation, Risk and Achievement, and One Story of Abject Failure by Stephen Hicks on Amazon.com. And while you're online, please leave a review for the Open College Podcast on iTunes or Stitcher. Now back to the podcast.
Can I ask you a little bit about what your life has been like, let's say, over the last couple of years, as you've used social media more and as your work has become much more disseminated and discussed publicly? What's been the pluses and the minuses for you, and what's changed for you?
Yeah, overall pluses outweigh the minuses, definitely. Well, the main minus has been that it's cut a lot into my writing time. In some ways, majorly, I'm a stereotypical nerd. My ideal day is to go to the library with my computer and read and write with a stack of books. And I envision my professor's life as being dominated by that. But certainly for the last couple of years, my writing and thinking time has been lessened. The other major negative just has been, it's just the crap you have to put up with people who are on various hobby horses who disagree with you, but who don't have social skills to know how to have a fruitful discussion. So they send you ad hominem emails and just resort to insults because you disagree with them. So there's been a certain steady stream of that, but part of my learning curve has been just to be able to ignore that or filter that out and focus on the positive responses and the critical responses that are raising good questions. I did want to mention, if I can plug, I have an open college podcast series, and I've got 2 podcasts in the work where I'm taking up the serious and in some cases good criticisms that have been raised of my work. I'm working on those as well. And while I am down on postmodernism, I should say that I do think it's an important part of any person's education to at least for some time consider the most skeptical and nihilistic arguments that are out there. That postmodernism should have a seat at the table in any person's education. And so it really should be a 3 or 4 way debate that's going on there, and students need to process those arguments for themselves. The other pluses are that I do enjoy travel. So in addition to my normal academic conferencing and academic lectures, I've been giving some public intellectual lectures and interacting with the general public, more thinking public. And that's been a lot of fun. It's actually been very encouraging to realize how many smart, knowledgeable people there are out there in the world living full lives, doing very interesting things. But they also have an interest in intellectual matters, and you can have a very fun conversation with them about Nietzsche or Marx or the current state of higher education. So I found that the tourism part that comes with the travel and just interacting with people that I never would have interacted to be very pleasurable. The other big plus has been, since I'm a professor, I just love young students in their first, second year of university when they realize how big the intellectual world is and how exciting it can be that when they come alive intellectually. And then having a lot more students from around the world who will email me or Facebook me with very interesting questions, or they have their own podcast. And when I can, I'll have a 45 or 50-minute conversation with them on their podcast. So just interacting with a lot more students from other parts of the world than I otherwise would have.
The thing is about the public exposure and the social media exposure that's so interesting is that the people who come to listen to you only come because they want to listen to you. It's a real pure form of the university, because there's no compulsion as there is with, say, mandatory classes and grades and so on in universities. That's right. And there is this tremendous public hunger for philosophical discourse that's really been completely, in some sense, undiscovered up until now, and it's massive.
And that's why I think ultimately I am optimistic, because I think it is built into human nature to want to be vigorous, to engage with the world, And since we're such a smart species, to engage with the world intellectually. So young people in their teens, when they are becoming more fully aware of themselves as independent of their parents and that their whole life is ahead and they're preparing for life, they do have this hunger. And it's beautiful to see it activated.
Yeah, well, and obviously, all the controversy that surrounded your work hasn't soured you in the least on the intellectual enterprise. It sounds like quite the contrary. Well, what are you working on now? Like, what? I know you're having a hard time writing, but like, if over the next 5 years, let's say, you've got ambitions.
Starting the end of this academic year, mid-May, a significant amount more of writing time. And so I'm making progress, and I'm optimistic that by the end of this calendar year, I'll be almost done this next book. What I'm doing is focusing on the positive. The postmodernism book is negative. The Nietzsche and the Nazis book is negative, going into some dark philosophical and political territory. But to put it positively, what are the positive philosophical issues and positions that need to be developed to reinvigorate the Enlightenment, to correct its deficiencies, to make people realize that the postmodern arguments are powerful, but they're powerfully based on some often easy philosophical issues or mistakes to make, very subtle. So my value added is as a philosopher. The way I'm going to, in part, package this is to say that we do have huge debates along any number of dimensions about politics and so on. But in fact, most of our debates about politics are not at all about politics. They are about underlying philosophical issues. So, for example, we're having debates right now about the proper political status of, say, transgender individuals. But we're spending very little time actually talking about the politics of it. Instead, we are having arguments about human nature and to what extent things are fixed causally and to what extent things are a matter of human volition, what things are subjective, what things are objective, and so on. And so really we are having philosophical arguments, hopefully philosophical arguments that should be informed by biology. But even that is itself a philosophical debate, because some people want to say we should approach this as a scientific method type of question, look at the facts, look at the experiments, and others have a more free-floating ideological commitment. That is to say, they're operating on a different epistemology. So really what we're doing is we're having debates about epistemology and human nature, not really debates about politics. Politics is just a manifestation of that. And then my hopeful professional value added is to bring clarity and some fresh perspectives on those philosophical debates. Sorry, I'll just say one more thing. It has plagued philosophy as a whole number of false alternatives that have been entrenched in the discipline for generations. And in many cases, if you can notice two apparently opposed arguments, but realize they have a shared premise, and in often cases that shared premise is implicit, then asking what the alternatives to that implicit premise would be once you make it explicit can be very illuminating. So I'm working that territory a lot.
Well, it's interesting, that maybe one of the consequences is that out of the, let's call it, rather murky darkness of moral relativism and postmodernism and the claim that power is the fundamental motivation of human beings. I mean, these are very pessimistic philosophical statements taken almost you would think to their logical extreme, that maybe what'll happen is that out of that will come something like a philosophy that's genuinely optimistic without being naive.
Yeah, exactly. That's nicely put. I'm reminded of a line from the Roman poet Horace, who was reflecting on some of the skeptical and nihilistic trends of his time, where they were, in effect, denying the natural world, denying and so forth. And the line is, though you drive nature out with a pitchfork, ever she will return.
Right.
So the optimistic return is what we're working on now.
Look, I really appreciate you taking the time to talk to me again. I always find our conversations extremely illuminating.
Great. I appreciate the invitation and spending time with you as well.
The host of the Open College podcast, Dr. Stephen Hicks, is a renowned philosopher and author. His field of study and insights into postmodernism explain how it has become one of the most powerful intellectual movements of our time, and what that actually means. If you'd like to access more information from Dr. Hicks himself, then check out his website at www.stephenhicks.org. You'll be able to find details on his latest publications, courses, and philosophical information concerning business ethics, education, intellectual history, and religion. To stay up to date with the latest from Stephen Hicks himself, make sure you've subscribed to the Open College Podcast feed and follow at Open College Podcast on all your favourite social networks. And while you're online, please leave the show a review on iTunes and Stitcher.